you. It's nice to be back and see one or two new faces, but mostly familiar faces. So you obviously didn't manage to scare you off too much. What I'm going to do today is in 3 parts, which is more or less, as Florian suggested to me, that these talks should be. I get the impression that the idea is there should be a few minutes of introduction just to talk about the general area, what my particular interests are, and then give you a talk on some of my current research, and then if anyone wishes to stay later, do some sort of workshoppy type activity. Well, I am going to split it into 3 bits, but what I'm going to talk about is phonetics, is the sounds of speech, and the idea of sameness and difference in phonetics. And I'd like to look at that in 3 contrasting ways, and so I'm slightly bending Florian's structure of the talk in order to be able to do that. But the introductory section is going to be me talking a little bit about some of my general interests in phonetics, what phonetics is about and how it relates to phonology. And in fact, the relationship between phonetics and phonology is to do with spotting what might count as the same in phonetics, what might count as different. So I'm going to talk for a while about that and use a particular example from English to inform that part of the talk. And I'll mention repetition and repair and things towards the end of that. And then the main bulk of the talk is going to be on the current research project that I'm working with Linda at Leeds, which is working on a corpus of spontaneous Dutch, looking at self-repair in Dutch. So I'll talk a bit about some of our recent results from that project. And then, for anyone who wishes to stay for a little bit longer, if you haven't had enough by then, the workshopping activity will be listening for sameness and difference. Now, I know at least some of the people in the room here have had some phonetic training. Some of you probably haven't, so there'll be a bit of a mixture, so we'll see how it goes. But we're going to run an informant session and have somebody speaking some strange, bizarre language that you will never have come across before. And we'll see what we can work out from listening to the phonetics of that language, trying to work out what might count as the same, what might count as different. So, what's phonetics about? It seems a bit strange to talk about things at such a general level, but I think it's an important way in. The core interests of phonetics, the core skills that are involved in being a phonetician, involve several areas. I've just noted 4 of them up there. Firstly, impressionistic listening, so being able to use these tools and hear what's going on and do some sort of interpretation of what people are doing when they're speaking. And that, of course, involves the practical skill of learning some method of transcription and practicing distinguishing between different sounds and so on. And phonetics is also involved in describing articulation. So what is it you're actually doing when you're producing speech? How are you moving your jaw and your lips and your tongue and flopping around all the bits of meat in order to make sound come out? So what is it that we're actually doing when we make sound, when we make speech sounds in general? Phonetics is also interested in acoustics, so what is the sound that we make, the sound that comes out of our mouths? How can we analyse that sound? How can we relate it to the patterns of articulation, the sort of configurations of the mouth and so on? And then also perception, how do we hear that sound? What happens to that sound when it gets to our ears? To some extent, all of this can be divorced from language, because we're just talking about the physical stuff of what happens if you move your tongue forward a bit, or what happens if you move your lips like that. You can hear it has quite an effect on the quality of the sound. And you can just describe what happens in those cases without reference to any particular language. But it seems that we humans have a remarkable degree of control over all these bits and pieces of meat that we flop around. And so, if we have control over them, it's some sort of learned activity. We've worked out how to do what we do. And if it's a learned activity, it's going to be part of our grammar, in a sense, part of our linguistic system, what we've learned to do. So there's a diagram some of you have seen before. a representation of the speech chain where one thinks of something in this bit of chewing gum here. Noise comes out of this stuff. Here's the noise goes into this stuff and back to the blob of chewing gum. And if things have worked properly, what's started off in the big blob of chewing gum inside my head is vaguely similar to what's occurring in your heads, although you're all thinking, when's he going to shut up? I'm hungry, and all those other things as well that I couldn't possibly know. But as far as language works, that's how it's supposed to go. However, when phonology gets involved, it looks things up a bit. Because, for example, I can say the same word several times. I can say lid, 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 lid. You know it's the same word. But if we were to look closely enough, if we were to listen closely enough, you would hear that it wasn't absolutely identical every single time. So there is some sort of margin for error. You know, I can make mistakes, I can do things in slightly different ways, and yet somehow we know that it counts as the same word. That's where phonology comes in. It's how do we know what things count as the same in order to make this word lid, and how what things count as different in order to make sure this is not the word lit, for example. And so somehow from all this sound, we get these categories emerging, these linguistic categories. Whatever it is that distinguishes the word lit from lid, there's some phonetics involved there, some sound, but there's also some sort of representation in your brain, presumably, to say something's going on here and this makes this one word, and if we change bits of it, it turns up as another word. Classically, this is discussed in terms of phonemes and allophones. So phonemes are families of sounds which count as the same. They're different sounds that we might make, if we listen carefully enough, be able to identify that they're different sounds, but they count as being the same sound. And as a metaphor for that, if you like, an analogy, you could think of letters written in different fonts or different handwriting styles. So lots of different kinds of letter A still counts as an A, even though physically they are slightly different from each other. And phonemes are an abstract entity. It's like the concept of the first letter of the alphabet, independently of all these different physical representations of that particular letter. Or the concept of a particular phonological category, independent of the physical representations of all these little bits of sound. And allophones are contextually dependent variants. They're particular sounds that occur in particular places that are part of this one overarching category of phoneme. And if you want to carry on that analogy with letters, then we've got uppercase letters and lowercase letters. So uppercase letters appear in some contexts, typically at the beginning of a sentence or the beginning of a proper name, and lowercase letters appear in other contexts, typically not in those places. However, we can only take this analogy with letters so far, because as it's dawning on one or two of you, I can tell, a little blast from the past for some of you. Behold, the red screen of doom. Sounds and letters are not the same thing. Okay, we had fun, those of you who were in my first year lectures, we had fun with this at the time, but I'm going to explore a little bit more why those, a little bit more depth than we were able to do at that stage, why those two things ought to be kept well apart. So, here's my example for this introductory section. From English, can you think of, you didn't think you have to do anything, but you do. Can you think of words in English that begin with 3 consonants? By that I mean 3 consonant sounds. Splash. I was prepared, where's my pen? Splash.
Strength.
Strength. Let me just check this is the ball right. Straight. Straight. Straight.
Sprint.
Okay. Patterns seem to be emerging here. Okay? Is there an obvious pattern to these things? Anything these words have in common? They all start with the same letter. Okay, they all start with this sound. Splash, strength, straight, sprint. Okay, that's the most obvious thing that turns up when you think of words in English that start with 3 consonants. The first one is always s, which is weird. Okay, why should there be that restriction on what that consonant is? it is a bit strange. So, there is an intriguing pattern. All of these things are initial, they all have an S at the beginning. And when we start to wonder about how we account for this sort of thing, it turns out to be problematic. When we look in the phonology, we can say, well, either an extra bit of structure is required. So, for example, normally, for most of English, you only need to have clusters of 2 consonants. And there's this one weird set of examples where all of a sudden you need to allow for an extra one and say, oh, you're allowed to have 3 consonants at the beginning, as long as the first one of them is S. And there are other constraints in there as well, but that's the big one. First one is S. Okay? So, if it wasn't for this set of stuff, you could say all English words have a maximum of 2 consonants at the beginning. And that would be nice and neat, and it would fit really nicely, and it would fit better with other languages as well. Okay, English is a bit weird in this respect. Plenty of respects in which English is weird, but this is one. So it's odd, you say, okay, we have to allow for an extra consonant slot in our phonology to say you're allowed to have 3, only in this one particular instance, which is a bit strange. There's also a thing called the sonority hierarchy. I don't know, have any of you come across the sonority hierarchy? I can't remember whether I talked about that in classes, and not all of you, of course, were in the classes anyway. Basically, it's a way of accounting for the sort of consonants you get in particular places, and the idea is, roughly speaking, the closer you get to the vowel in the middle of a syllable, the more vowel-like the consonants will be. So typically you get plosives, which are sort of p, t, b, k, that sort of sound. At the edges of syllables, you get approximates like l and r and w, sort of closer to the middle. So if you're going to have a plosive and an approximant in a syllable, the plosive, if it's at the beginning, the plosive comes first, and then the approximant, so you get things like pr or qu, and at the end it's the other way around. So the plosives are on the edge. Fricatives come in between those 2 things in sonority, which is why this is weird. You know, print is fine. You've got a plosive here and a r, which is more vowel-like. But when you stick a s on there, if you believe in sonority, it should come in between the 2. It should be psrint. But it isn't. And psrint sounds mildly weird. Okay? So it's odd. This thing mucks up a generalization which seems to work quite nicely across lots and lots of languages. So it's weird for that reason as well. So the sonority hierarchy doesn't seem to work. There are 2 standard approaches to a solution. One is to say, okay, I'm going to do something fancy with the structure and say this doesn't actually count as being part of the syllable. So some approaches to phonology, glad he's not here actually, a guy called Mike Hammond who's visiting at the moment. He's written a book on the phonology of English, which is very good. But one of the things that he shows in there is one possible way out of this. I don't know if it's original to him, but he shows it to say that the s, instead of being attached to a syllable, actually sort of sidesteps the syllable and actually belongs to a word level higher up in the structure. And it's sort of dangling off here. So you've got print and s. How do I get into these contours? You've got print and s, and it's separate, so it doesn't count when you're thinking about sonority. It's sort of extra syllabic, it's out of the way. So that's one way around it, which of course is cheating. I don't really mean it that strongly. Of course, because these things exist, any possible solution is going to be cheating on something. Okay, you've got to decide which thing is going to give in your analysis. Okay, that's one thing that is possible that would give the fact that these things are part of the syllable. There's another approach to phonology called government phonology, which says actually this thing belongs to what precedes. I can't technically say at the end of the preceding syllable because they don't have syllables in government phonology, but the equivalent thing. And it says this belongs to the word at the end, or we might have a blank vowel here. So if you just say the word sprint, it's blank vowel, no sound, and then print. Same sort of way out, saying it doesn't belong to the same syllable. Both of those things fail to predict the fact that this has a big effect on these things, the r here and the l there and so on. So if you say, well, plash isn't a real word, but print is, it's not r, it's print, and that's what tells you it's print and not brint. Okay, if there was such a word as brint, because it's not print, I can't even do it. Okay, the B one is brint, and the P one is print. Okay, but if you have SP, sprint, doesn't do it like that anymore, and there isn't an opposition between the p and the b. For those of you who understand these things, there isn't a voicing contrast here, it's neutralized. Okay, so if this S doesn't belong to that, how can you possibly account for the fact that there's something strange going on with the rest of the cluster because of the S? Okay, so defining the S out of it is problematic, but that's what everybody seems to do. Okay, here's another way of thinking about it. Keep generalizations such as sonority, but allow them to be violated. That says all your rules are just generalizations, and sometimes you can break them in particular circumstances. Maybe there's another generalization that is more important, like you are allowed to have S consonant to consonant, which is a bit ad hoc, but that's the other way that Mike does it in his book. But that is also a standard way of doing it. However, if we consider that some bits of phonetics that might sound the same actually don't count as the same, this is the weird bit. Okay, this is the non-standard, non-classical way of thinking about it. What if we have some bits of phonetics that sound the same, but don't actually count phonologically as the same? If we think in terms of the distribution of various bits of phonetics, that is, where do particular sounds turn up? John Coleman noticed that clusters of S plus a stop, so things like sp and st, and also things like sm with nasals in, they distribute in the same way as stops. So where you find a plain stop like p, you can also find these sort of clusters like sp. So he says these count as sort of constituents of a higher level category. So you can say, here's the onset, the consonants at the beginning of the syllable. You've got something which he calls closure, which might have this s followed by a consonant, and then the thing which he calls a glide, which is an optional thing, which includes things like l and r and y and w. Okay, so you have this bit of structure, and you say, because a stop on its own patterns in the same way as S plus the stop, you can count those as being equivalent. It's a bit like saying this is a noun or a noun phrase, and this will operate in the same sort of fashion. And that's all the syntax you're going to get, because I can't do syntax. But it's the same sort of idea. Okay, it's a distributional idea of how these things function in the structure. That's Coleman's idea, which is neat. Okay, it starts to get around the problem. But it's possible to have a more radically non-segmental analysis, that is not chopping things up into letter-like portions, which is where I'm going with sounds that are not the same as letters. Okay, I never went this far, except in third-year phonology classes, about the sounds not equaling letters. But this is where it's going. This is where you end up if you think in those terms. If we observe that voicing is neutralized in these things, then we can make some interesting analyses based on that. Okay? Here's my way of thinking about voicing, whether things are p or b or t or d sort of contrast in onset clusters of consonants, the consonants at the beginning of the syllable. You can have voiced things in a word like bray. Okay, is an example word. Phonemically, we might write it that way for people who care about that sort of thing. Phonetically, it's probably something like this. Bray, bray. Possibly a voicing during the closure. I've transcribed it here without, but you might get it. And a short voice onset time after release. So what that means is you get the r rather than the sh version. Okay? Voiceless one, in pray, you get the sh version. That's a voiceless diacritic, which is saying here. No voicing during the closure, long voice onset time after the release, which is equivalent to aspiration. My weird, bizarre idea is to say there is a third category of voicing in these cases. And I call it a sibilated, because I like the word. And what that means is there is voiceless frication before the closure, so you get a voiceless fricative here, no voicing during the closure, and a short BOT after the release in a word like spray. In other words, these sort of instances. Okay? So instead of saying there's two kinds of voicing, and then you have this weird neutralized case with something strange stuck on the front, what I'm saying is you have three kinds of voicing in onset consonants, which is bizarre. And I admit this is a weird way of thinking about it. But it seems to my strange, weird mind to work quite nicely. And typically what people might say when they look at this is say, well, how can you say what's going on in voicing here? Actually, what's happening is phonetically you're getting something before the closure. Okay? I'm saying there's something phonological going on here, but the phonetics of it are happening before the closure. Well, what I'd say to that is, in this sort of case, if you actually listen carefully to the phonetics, What's happening here in this contrast is the phonetics are voicing what's happening after the closure. So if we're allowed to assign things based on what happens after them, why not on what happens before them? Why can't we do it that way as well? So that's a bit of a slightly weird way of thinking of it. And if we think in those terms, then what happens is these three consonant clusters aren't three consonant clusters, they're actually two consonant clusters. Because this thing here ain't a consonant. It's just part of the phonetics of another bit of what's going on there. So here we have an onset with some value for voicing, voiced, voiceless or sibilated, and a stop of some kind, and then what Coleman calls a glide. Okay? So in my way of looking at it, these are two consonant onsets. So we don't have to have the extra bit of structure that says you need three. It doesn't violate sonority because this thing isn't a consonant, and you still have sonority working between those two. Seems like a neat solution, he said modestly. But a consequence is that whatever the S is at the beginning of spray, or words like these, it's not the same object as the S at the beginning of a word like say, where it is a proper consonant in an onset. Because here, because it's so restricted, what I'm claiming is that this thing isn't a consonant. There's a bit of noise that goes around with these other two consonants. I'm claiming phonological is not a consonant. That's a weird idea. I've never heard anybody else say that. I probably ought to learn that lesson, but that's one way of thinking about it. So what I'm saying is what looks like the same phonetics, in other words, that sound, can count as something radically different in the phonology, if you're willing to think in those sort of radical, non-segmental type ways. Okay, any questions on that before I sort of move on? I've just thrown a bizarre bit of phonology at you without you realising it. But, okay. I hardly ever get the chance to talk about that stuff, and it was really nice because it repetition is a case study which is leading on to the current research stuff. In repetition, you have the same lexis, the same words, but potentially different phonetics. If you repeat a word, you could do it the same way, or you could do it differently. In theory, we have the choice. A lot of old work on this was done on the distinction between given things and new things. So people have done psycholinguistic experiments that show that if you say a word that has been said not that long ago, then it tends to have reduced phonetics, like you say it a bit more sloppily and maybe quieter. You tend to see, in sort of lay terms, it sounds as if you're taking less care over it, because we already know what it is. But there's a lot of more recent work informed by work in interactional linguistics that suggests that it doesn't always work in that sort of way. So, for example, there's some work on what's called doubles, that is, what happens when you come to the end of a particular topic of conversation. One possible way of closing down a topic is to do some sort of little summary or some sort of little bit of words and then repeat it again. Just say the same thing twice. So you could say, okay, we've done this fancy bit of phonology and there we are, there we are. Okay, and I repeated there we are. And listen out now, you'll hear people doing that now and again. When they come to the end of a topic of conversation, they say something, and then they say it again, perhaps a little bit quieter. Okay, so there is a sort of phonetic pattern going on with that. There's also some work on other initiated repair, that is, when the other person you're talking to says what or pardon, and you repeat what you said, that says actually whether you do it quieter and more sloppily, or whether you do it louder and with more emphasis, depends on the interaction, depends on the conversation, it depends on things like who came in while somebody else was still talking and that sort of business. So the interaction seems to have a big effect on what the actual phonetics is. And interaction, as John Local calls it, is speech in its natural habitat. Okay, that's where we normally speak when we're talking to each other. What I'm doing now is strange. I'm standing up, speaking out loud, and you're all sitting there quietly. That's unusual. People don't normally do that sort of thing. Normally we're doing some sort of interactive situation. And part of what we're looking at in our project now is speech errors, when you make some sort of mistake and you correct yourself rather than have somebody else asking for clarification. So, at least for this particular kind of error, I'm going to talk about two different kinds of errors, but one of them is this kind. At least for speech errors, you've got the same lexis, the same words, effectively. Just you said it wrong the first time. And what we're looking at are things like, is the phonetics designed to be the same as the thing that went wrong? I mean, obviously not quite, because you want to correct the error, but things like the pitch or the loudness and things, are they going to be the same as what went wrong, or are they going to be different? So, this project that we're working on is called Modelling the Prosody of Self-Repair. By prosody we mean things like the pitch of the speech, we mean things like the loudness, we mean things like rhythmic characteristics. And we're looking at various factors as it happens in spontaneous Dutch. Now, Leendert, you may guess from his name, is Dutch. We're working on a corpus of spontaneous Dutch that was not collected for this purpose. Okay, so the people who are speaking in there are speaking normal language. They're doing conversations, they're doing interviews, it's things that have been broadcast on the radio. None of them knew what we were going to do with it, because it was recorded a few years ago and we're just playing with it. So it's almost as close as you can get to things like a double-blind test in science, because nobody who was involved in collecting this stuff, or neither the people who recorded it nor the people who did it, knew what purpose we were going to put it to. So it has that sort of scientific validity as well. And grateful thanks to the Economic and Social Research Council, who are currently paying my salary. Right, so what's this about? But not for much longer, sadly. Anyway, what we're looking at is self-initiated self-repair. So, something goes wrong, you say something wrong, you correct yourself. So, potentially you could say, well, thank you for coming to this talk. These talks are happening on Friday. Okay, so you realise you've started saying the wrong day. Actually, that was the right day, and I corrected the wrong one. It was a bad example to begin with. Okay, you start off saying something, realise it's wrong, correct it to the correct thing. Okay, these things happen all the time in normal speech. We slip up and we correct ourselves. And previous research on the phonetics of these things suggests there's a number of things going on. Nederland and Cutler have looked at some of these things also in Dutch. I mean, as it happens, a lot of this work has been on Dutch, so it's quite neat that we're also using Dutch. They looked at people saying the wrong word and repairing it, and they found a difference between what they called error repairs and appropriateness repairs. What that means is an error repair is something like Friday, where what you say is factually wrong and you need to correct it. An appropriateness repair is where what you say is sort of right, it's just not quite the right sort of word. So, for example, in a very formal setting, I might talk about this guy, this man. You know, if I correct guy to man, they both sort of mean the same thing, but it just wasn't quite the right place for that word. It wasn't actual factual error, as in this case. And they noticed that these appropriateness repairs seem to have what they call prosodic marking, so some sort of big change in pitch or amplitude or duration. So they seem to be designed to be different from the thing that had gone wrong, whereas the error repairs seem to be designed to be much the same. Another approach to this by Steve Notenboom, who looks at speech error repairs. He sort of forces people to do tongue twisters and then records what they do. And he found a difference between whether the thing that goes wrong was interrupted early or whether it was allowed to be finished and then corrected. And basically the interrupted ones are designed to be different. They come out higher pitch, they come out louder, and they come out faster actually as well. They come out sooner, they're done without a gap. The ones that are interrupted, whereas if you complete them, then you don't seem to do that. You seem to do things quieter or with less marking in that sense. He suggests that these interrupted ones coming in louder and so on are designed to hide the error. We don't necessarily buy that analysis, but at the very least they're different and they may show some sort of distinction in how we're planning and monitoring speech, there being two different ways of repairing it. Leendert did some work before this project on timing things in spontaneous Dutch conversations. So this is spontaneous speech again, as opposed to these other people who've been working on laboratory speech. And he found that repairs were coming in faster, the faster speech rate, there was temporal compression, and it didn't seem to matter whether it was an error type or an appropriateness type one. So basically what we're doing is expanding his earlier work and trying to do in more detail in more cases. We're looking at lexical replacement repairs, whether it's the wrong word, and speech error repairs, where it's the right word but just said wrong. From spontaneous Dutch conversation, we're looking at things like timing, pitch, loudness, between the referendum bit, the thing that needs repairing, the thing that's gone wrong, and the repair itself. And we're looking at some of the factors that other people have identified, and also bringing in some more context-sensitive factors. So what data have we got? Well, so far we've analysed 141 instances of lexical replacement repair and 234 instances of speech error repair taken from parts of this spoken Dutch corpus. We are currently working on expanding that data set. So whatever that adds up to, 375, is that right? Yes. We're now up to about 600 or 700 examples that we've found, but the other ones are not analysed yet, so I can't really say anything about what they're like. These are what some of them look like. So here are some lexical replacement ones, like the au met de bus. So that's starting to say by car, but then correcting it to by bus. Here we've got gebruik werkt, where you've got, again, one word using to works corrected. Leuke mooie, sort of nice corrected to beautiful. Here, paar jaar corrected to tijd, again, just those things corrected. This is an interesting one, kerk corrected to koning. So this is Church Square or King's Square. Notice that part of this is right. Okay, this second part of this street name is correct, but it's just the first bit that gets corrected here. Speech errors where it's the same word, public or public, just got the wrong vowel in there, and so on. There are various other examples in there. Sort of everyday word that crops up in conversation. Like frontal lobe. But it's there in the conversation, it happens, it needs accounting for. So that's what we've got, that's what we're looking at. So first of all, let's have a look at some quantitative analysis of some of this stuff. This is what our labelling looks like. We've got a sort of lexical labelling here. We've labelled which bits of the referendum, which bits of the repair. We've noted where the error actually starts to happen, and that sort of thing. So we're using these bits and pieces for measurements of duration, speech rate, and so on, and also as locations in which to find other prosodic information out of all this sort of messy, scribbly stuff, which is a representation of the acoustics. And there's just another example from speech error repair. Here the error onset doesn't coincide with the beginning of the word because it's actually this vowel here that's wrong. This public and corrected to public here. We measured loads of stuff. Basically, you don't need to worry about all the details. We measured articulation rate of all sorts of things. We measured a sort of proportional articulation rate to try and normalise for overall speech rate. So in other words, we could say how much faster is the repair than the error, or how much slower is it. We looked at the maximum of F0 maximum pitch peaks and the median of pitch things in the vowels, and basically we sort of normalised the repair values by the referendum values. So in other words, what we're saying is not exactly how high is the pitch, but how much higher is it in the repair than in the referendum, or how much lower, and so on and so forth. And the same sort of thing for intensity or loudness measures. And all the lexical replacement repairs, we got two friendly Dutch linguists, one of whom was Leendert and the other one wasn't, to classify these things as error or appropriateness repairs. And what they did was the same as Leendert and Cutler did. Basically, they sort of decided what these things were. They got together and compared answers, and if they disagreed, they had a chat about it to see if they could come to some consensus, and if they did, all well and good. If they still couldn't agree, then we threw out those examples. Okay, so the ones where there was definitely no agreement, we've not analysed. So for example, from the ones we saw before, here au met de bus is an error repair. That's the wrong sort of vehicle has been selected. Whereas here, leuke to mooie is appropriateness, with nice and beautiful sort of mean the same thing, but it turns out that leuke is the wrong sort of word for the way the conversation is going. We'll come back to that example later. Speech errors here are all errors. Some of them are interrupted again, some of these are interrupted. So reflegeer is interrupted and reflecteerd there, whereas public is a complete one. You get to the end of the word public, and there's actually a gap there with a filler thing before you correct it to public. So that we've noted all those different kinds in our coding. And a whole pile of other stuff that we measured. let's not worry about all the details, but there's sort of different ways of measuring the durations of things from one event to another event, and counting how many segments there are in various different things as a very rough measure of how phonologically complex the words are. And we took account in our statistics of things like which bit of the corpus it came from, the nationality of the speakers, that is, are they Dutch or Belgian, and the actual identity of the speakers. And here are some of the results. NS here means not significant, okay, so that means there's no effect here. And these little asterisks, basically the more of these there are, the more significant the effect. So actually a lot of these are just one asterisk, are quite marginal, and I'm really not very confident that these are going to turn out to be robust. But these ones with 3 asterisks, probably quite interesting. If you want to know, this is p less than 0.05, this is p less than 0.001. So we found some interesting things here. So for example, in the F0 measurements, lexical errors are followed by repairs with a greater rise in F0 maximum and medium. So there's a difference between the lexical errors and the speech errors. We're not really sure whether that matters, to be honest. Interestingly, this was where we found a difference between appropriateness and error repairs in F0 maximum. But the big difference here is really whether the referendum is completed or interrupted. Okay, so an interrupted referendum, that is, if you don't finish saying the thing that's gone wrong and then you immediately correct it, the correction comes in a lot faster than if you completed the referendum. And similarly, this turns up also here in the number of segments from the onset of the error to the end of the referendum. However, this is sort of a measure of how long the referendum is, and interrupted referenda, other things being equal, are going to be shorter. So I suspect that this result is actually dependent on that, and this is less robust statistically, so I think it's just an epiphenomenon of this. So I think this is the key thing, whether the referendum is completed or interrupted, which is what Notabone found. And similarly, this speech rate seems to have an effect in terms of some other measurements of how long things are and how complex things are in terms of segments. So we don't need to worry too much about detail. But the biggest effect, this is a graphical representation of the biggest effect. Up the vertical axis is the proportional rate. So above this dotted line, the repair is faster than the error. Below the dotted line, the repair is slower than the error. The completed ones, you see, is actually not significantly different from 0. So basically, they're done the same rate. Whereas the interrupted ones are done faster here. So that's our neatest result so far. There's also a slight effect in F0. But the thing I think is most interesting is that the interrupted referenda, the interrupted errors, have a very wide range. So some of them, the F0 goes up a lot in the repair, so the repair's got much higher pitch. But also some of them it goes down a lot. So I suspect it might matter that it's different in those cases. And we've started looking at, instead of doing a continuous measure like this, looking at just noticeable differences and basically saying things like, is the pitch higher, the same, or lower? And if you look at it in those ways, then this sort of effect comes out a bit more strongly. Anyway, the most prominent effect seems to be on the proportional rate. Interrupted referenda are followed by repairs, which are speeded up. And so there's some effect also on the F0 on the pitch, but there's a difference in the overall distribution as well as a difference in the mean. Now, this is all very well, but it is actually a bit problematic because our best guess statistically at all this stuff accounts for less than 15% of all the variance in the data. So there's a lot of stuff going on in there that we can't account for in our statistical models. Let's say these numbers, 14% are the best we get. If I was forced to make a more reliable guess, I'd say it's probably between 8 and 10%. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know about looking at these models. So is it statistical noise due to all sorts of random things? We don't know. But we take this as motivation for investigating things a bit more carefully, looking at some of these other interaction-dependent categories. So that's what we're going on to do. We're starting to do a qualitative analysis on some of these categories. So firstly, why don't we get more significant effects. I'm going to skim through this actually, I think, because otherwise we're going to completely run out of time. But basically, the error appropriateness distinction, I think, operates differently in real conversation than the way it does in lab speech, because it can matter whether you get the word with exactly the right connotations. In real conversation, the difference between nice and beautiful might matter a lot in the conversation, whereas if you're just performing a task and saying, I want this nice thing or that beautiful thing, in a lab, it might not really matter so much. Again, I'm going to skim through this. Basically, Linda and I sat down and thought, which of these things sound prosodically marked, which is a really hard thing to do because we're both phoneticians, and instead of saying, is this marked, we started saying, well, the F0 in this syllable is a bit higher than the F, it's actually a hard job to do. But we did the same sort of thing where we agreed, we looked at those, and we found that actually only about 30% of our cases had this sort of prosodic marking where the repair was noticeably different, usually sort of louder or faster than the error. And we found basically three main ways of accounting for what's going on: topicalization, upgrading, and other, which is basically things we can account for but don't fit into those other two headings. And this sort of accounts for more than half of the instances we found, so it's still not brilliant, but at least we can work some of this out. What's topicalization? Well, topicalization is where the thing in the repair involves something that matters in the conversation. So it's a word that has been talked about up to then, or it is a word that's going on to be talked about. So, for example, this sentence, we'll not worry too much about this. In fact, I don't know that I'll even play out the sound for reasons of time. But basically, the idea is it depends on the distinction between walking shoes and sports shoes. And this person is saying, if you're going on long walks, you need to have proper walking shoes. And then ends up almost saying, like the ones I'm, but not what I'm wearing, what I've got on is walking shoes. And that sort of contradicts what she's just said. And so she corrects it to sports shoes. I'm wearing trainers rather than hiking boots, effectively, that sort of thing. So it's a word that matters in the discourse. Another example here, this is an appropriateness one rather than an error one. This is the Lurker and Moyer one. I might just play this. Moyer, you get a Moyer, big sort of pitch thing going on in Moyer. This is somebody who's talking about redoing their house and getting a new kitchen, and they say a nice corrected to a good kitchen. But that distinction matters because the Lurker word, the nice word, means it looks nice, not necessarily the best quality, whereas Moyer is more good, as in it's more likely to be good quality, and they go on to discuss things like how much it's going to cost. So the fact that it's Moyer rather than Lurker actually turns out to matter in the conversation. Upgrading, the next example is where what the speaker has said is all well and good, but actually they're trying to make a point, and they correct themselves to something more extreme, which helps their point. So it's sort of semantic upgrading in that sense. So this first example, somebody's been talking about the reasons for riots breaking out and saying the police should have known because there have been arrests and trouble and things. And they say in recent months and corrected to in recent weeks. So they're saying this is imminent, they should have known it's happening. The fact that it's weeks rather than months seems to matter in that sense. So that's
Mahambi.
So again, you get pitch rides in there. This other example. Again, you've got a pitch up there. That's correcting a number, and it's a politician saying we've got so many seats in the Parliament. We've got 64, correcting it to 66 seats in Parliament. And that turns out to matter because he's saying we're a big party, we're an important party. And in fact, the other people in that interview go on to argue about how many MPs they really have, because he's counting them a funny way. So that, again, that matters, and this is part of his argument. So there are those cases. Some other cases here. This is a case where somebody's introducing a minister in the government and gets the name of the department wrong, so correct it. This is a case where somebody says 14 or 15 something, and the other person says, oh yes, this happened in the 16th century, didn't it? So it's a historical fact. Linda assures me it's a historical fact that every Dutch child learns at school about when this person was reigning. So it's something that everybody should know. And in these cases, you could say the other person might be likely to come in and correct it, because here the minister's being introduced with the wrong department name. Here you get the century wrong. In fact, the other person then does come in and sort of reinforces that and says, oh yes, this monarch reigned in the 16th century. And maybe there's something going on there about how that works. And other repair like that seems to be dispreferred in conversation, where somebody else just comes in and corrects it. People seem to do work in conversation to avoid that happening. So maybe this is part of the work that's being done to avoid that happening. Okay. So it's clear that at least some of the variance in our data is not explained by the factors that we've got from the psycholinguistic experiments. But some of this stuff, some of this context-sensitive stuff, some of the interactional stuff is going on as well. But how much and how do you quantify this stuff? How do you put this into a model of what's going on? And that's not a trivial question to answer. And therefore, I don't propose to provide an answer this afternoon, because I haven't the foggiest idea. But that's the sort of thing that we're interested in working on and trying to build into things. What we're doing at the moment is examining the role of lexical frequency within the conversation, because there's a lot of evidence from corpus linguistics that how frequent a word is generally matters. So we're finding out these words that are corrected, are they frequent words in the whole corpus? Are they frequent words in a particular conversation? And seeing whether that, accounting for that, helps us decide what's going on. And as I say, we're expanding the data set. We're looking at just noticeable differences, so not just how much higher is the pitch, but actually can you hear that it's a different pitch or not, and just have that sort of binary distinction. And also investigating discourse relevance of the speech area repairs. Up to now, we've just looked at the lexical ones. Okay, so that's a rather too speedy overview of the sort of work we've been doing recently on this project. There are the references if you're interested. Thanks to Christina Englert, who is the other Dutch linguist who was coding these things. If you wish to follow our progress or see more of what's going on, then we've skipped from self-repair to self-promotion. We have a website which looks like this. It's not the most exciting website in the world, but the content is good. That's the address. That's me and that's him. Okay, so that's as far as I propose to go. So I've got time for questions before we do workshop-y stuff. Yeah.